Hi guys, today we are going to study about the basal ganglia, its connections and those famous diseases of the basal ganglia which we always talk about. For example, the Parkinson disease, Huntington chorea, acidosis, hemibalismus and Wilson's disease. So basically first let's get started by saying what is basal ganglia. Here, basal ganglia word is a misnomer because ganglia refers to the collection of the grey matter outside the central nervous system. But here, ganglia refers to the collection of the grey matter inside brain. But why the term basal then? Because it is located deep with respect to the cerebral cortex. Hence the term basal ganglia. The five nucleuses of the basal ganglia comprises of the caudate nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus, the subthalamic nucleus and the substantia nigra. The caudate nucleus, putamen, and globus pallidus, the three structures are derived from the word telencephalin, hence I have written the name T in the left corner. The subthalamic nucleus is derived from diencephalin, and the substantia nigra, which is located inside the midbrain, is derived from mesencephalin. The substantia nigra is the nucleus which is involved in the pathology of the Parkinson disease. The putamen and the globus pallidus together are known as a lentiform nucleus because when they are seen in an anatomical location, these two together comprises of a shape resembling a lens, hence the name the lentiform nucleus. The putamen is in anatomy is in close proximity to globus pallidus, but in physiology, in the functional point of view, is more closely related to the caudate nucleus. Hence, the caudate and the putamen together have given the name the neostriatum. But the neostriatum, because they are more phylogenetically new and they are more evolved in function as compared to the other nucleuses, hence the word the neostriatum. And the other structure is a corpus striatum. The corpus striatum refers to caudate, putamen and plus minus globus pallidus. Please important to note here is why I have written plus minus globus pallidus, because this has always been a debate between the anatomists and the physiologists that whether globus pallidus is to be involved in corpus striatum or not. So this debate will I think continue overall. So now let's get started and see. Now let's see the cadaveric section of the brain. This is an axial section taken from the cadaver, hence the name the cadaveric section. I have zoomed this image for the better understanding of the locations and how these basal ganglia nucleuses look. So the outside grey matter, which is your cerebral cortex, and the inside grey matter located deep in the white matter are these nucleuses. For example, this being the caudate nucleus, and these two structures together known as a lentiform nucleus are made up of two things, the putamen and the globus pallidus, the inner one the globus pallidus. This blue structure here is your thalamus. Thalamus is not itself a nucleus of the basal ganglia but is very important for the functioning of the basal ganglia, because thalamus, basal ganglia and your supplemental motor area together, they are very closely related for their function point of view. Now we'll see an axial section of brain to again see the different nucleuses. For example, the nucleus here is a caudate nucleus. Here shown is the caudate nucleus. The nucleus, this is the putamen, and the nucleus medial to the putamen is your globus pallidus. Globus pallidus itself has two segments, the external segment and the internal segment. Now I would like to discuss a bit about the caudate nucleus and the putamen. These two, as we know, they have been known as striatum or neostriatum, etc. The 95% of these neurons secrete GABA, and hence the 95% they are GABAergic neurons. But only a minority and 5% of the neurons release acetylcholine, hence only 5% of acetylcholine. The globus pallidus, the external segment and internal segment, both are completely GABAergic neurons. So subthalamic nucleus is an exciting part of the basal ganglia because it is the only excitatory nucleus of the basal ganglia releasing glutamate. And now we'll talk about the substantia nigra. Substantia nigra has two parts. It has one part is known as the pars compacta and the other part is referred to as the pars reticularis. From the clinical point of view, pars compacta is very important because it releases dopamine. Because pars compacta is very important because ultimately substantia nigra, pars compacta is the ultimate pathology which occurs in the Parkinson disease, and hence it secretes dopamine. There is a problem in pathology of pars compacta leading to depleting levels of dopamine. This here I have pasted the image of a cross section of midbrain. As you can see here that we can very well see this image of midbrain having substantia nigra. The substantia nigra has the word nigra in it because nigra refers to this pigmentation of black. This pigmentation of black here comes because of the deposit of the melanin inside substantia nigra. This structure ultimately is responsible for secreting dopamine, which actually is very important for the role of the basal ganglia. When there's a pathology in it, which is seen in Parkinson disease, you can clearly see that there's a destroying of substantia nigra, leading to a very diminished substantia nigra, having very less of melanin and hence very less blackening. So let's now discuss the functions of the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia is basically overall related to the gross motor movements in the overall coordination and functioning of it. So it helps in the planning and the programming of the movement. It helps in the control and the coordination of the complex pattern of movement, and it converts an abstract thought into a voluntary movements. Despite of these voluntary movement function, it also helps a role in the cognitive functioning. So when we discuss about the diseases of the basal ganglia, we will always notice that these diseases also have a cognitive component in the symptoms. Let's talk about the connections of the basal ganglia. Now let's talk about the connections of the basal ganglia. It all starts when cortex releases glutamate, which ultimately is going first of all to stimulate the striatum. Here when I say striatum, I'm basically referring to choroid and putamen and not globus pallidus. In this key, wherever I have used a red arrow, it refers to an inhibitory response, and wherever I have used a black arrow, it refers to an excitatory response. Now, in basal ganglia, starting from striatum, we have two pathways. One is a direct pathway and the other is the indirect pathway. First, I am going to discuss about the indirect pathway. Striatum, having 95% of the GABAergic neurons, releases GABA, which acts in the external segment of the globus pallidus in the indirect pathway. Globus pallidus then again releases GABA, which acts on the subthalamic nucleus. Whenever there are two GABA responses in series, it produces a phenomenon known as disinhibition, which ultimately leads to the stimulation of the next nucleus. That is a stimulation of the subthalamic nucleus. Subthalamic nucleus being the only excitatory nucleus of the basal ganglia releases glutamate, which actually then stimulates the globus pallidus internal segment. Globus pallidus internal segment then releases GABA, which has a negative response on the thalamus. So here, as we can conclude that the indirect pathway causes a inhibitory response ultimately on the thalamus. Now we'll talk about the direct pathway. The direct pathway starts when the striatum releases GABA, which then acts on the globus pallidus internal segment. The globus pallidus internal segment then releases GABA again. So here also, when there are two GABA responses in series, this phenomena is known as disinhibition, which ultimately will cause the stimulation of the thalamus. So as we studied that the indirect pathway causes the inhibition of the thalamus, whereas the direct pathway causes stimulation of the thalamus. So here we can write that direct pathway causes the stimulation of thalamus. This thalamus then will release glutamate, which will then further act on the supplemental motor area, which is then responsible for carrying out the motor movement, which is responsible for motor movements, right? So this is how the connection of the basal ganglia work. But here there is also one important thing. Where is the pathway? Then here is where the pathology of the Parkinson disease lies. This happens when there is a bypass limb from the striatum in the direct pathway, which goes towards substantia nigra pars compacta. Substantia nigra pars compacta is the only nucleus in the whole basal ganglia pathway which releases dopamine. And here the one thing which needs to be concerned is that dopamine can act as an excitatory as well as an inhibitory neurotransmitter depending on the receptor on which it acts. When dopamine acts on the D1 receptor, it leads to a excitatory response, whereas when it acts on D2 receptor, it leads to an inhibitory response. This is how this works. Now I need to focus on this fact that all the connections in the basal ganglia are with ipsilateral cortex. That means that if we are talking about the left cortex, then we are talking only about the left basal ganglia and not about the right basal ganglia or vice versa, which tells us that the connections in the basal ganglia are always ipsilateral. Now I'm going to talk about the diseases of the Now let's talk about the diseases of the basal ganglia. First, I'm going to talk about the most important disease, that is the Parkinson disease. Parkinson disease is characterized by the degeneration of the nigrostriatal tract, or basically there is destroying of the substantia nigra pars compacta nucleus. Here basically, as seen in these connections, this limb from the substantia nigra pars compacta to the striatum becomes defective. The defect of this limb basically leads to the disease of Parkinson. In this disease, basically, because when this limb is involved, there is relative fall in the dopamine level, and there is relative rise in the acetylcholine level. The four cardinal symptoms of the Parkinson disease are tremors, rigidity, bradykinesia, and the postural instability. Tremors are characteristically seen in the upper limb and are described as a pill rolling movements, as if it appears that the patient is trying to roll a pill between thumb and his fingers. Second feature is a rigidity. Tremors and rigidity together superimposed on upper limb are seen as cogwheel rigidity. The third symptom is the bradykinesia and the akinesia. It appears as the patient is trying to move very fast, but he is not able to take his steps at the pace that he wants. The fourth symptom is a postural instability, because the center of the gravity of these patients are towards the forward, and they always appear that they are trying to prevent themselves from falling down. The autonomic symptoms associated are postural hypotensions and the fecal disturbance and the urinary incontinence. Along with these autonomic symptoms, there's also other symptoms associated like depression, anosmia, masked faces, and dementia. And these autonomic symptoms and extra symptoms are not due to the dopamine deficiency but are associated with serotonin, acetylcholine, and other neurotransmitter deficiencies. Though it is not able to pinpoint the reason of why these symptoms are appear, but these symptoms are very commonly associated with Parkinson disease. Now let's talk about the causes of the Parkinson disease. The first most important is the idiopathic. As the most common reason of perhaps of having Parkinson disease is idiopathic. It cannot be explained. Second being drugs and metals like manganese, and there's also a compound like MPTP, which is seen in the drug heroin, is responsible for causing Parkinson disease. Some infections, and as a post-traumatic injury also you can encounter a Parkinson disease patient. For example, a famous boxer known as Muhammad Ali suffered from Parkinson disease, and as a post-traumatic reason was accounted to be the cause of his Parkinson disease. On histopathology, we see a body known as the Lewy bodies. These Lewy bodies are nothing but they are the intracytoplasmic eosinophilic inclusion bodies containing of excess of the alpha-synuclein protein. Alpha-synuclein protein is normal, but the abnormal excessive accumulation of these protein in the cytoplasm is seen as a Lewy body. Here we can clearly see in the histopathological feature in the body that this body is referred to being as a Lewy body. Now we'll talk about the radiology of the Parkinson disease. This is how a normal swallowtail appearance looks like. Why am I describing a swallowtail? Because in radiology it is described the substantia nigra appears as a swallowtail appearance, but in the case of a Parkinson disease patient, the swallowtail appearance of the substantia nigra is completely destroyed and is completely distorted, and it looks like somewhat mismanaged. This is how the radiology of the midbrain looks like. The treatment of the Parkinson disease is hugely dependent on a drug known as a levodopa, which is referred to as it's a precursor of the dopamine, which gets converted inside the brain into dopamine and is responsible for symptomatic treatment. And this drug has been referred to as a gold standard treatment of the Parkinson disease. Now let's talk about the Huntington's disease. In Huntington's disease is an atrophy of the caudate nucleus. This disease is autosomal dominant and there is defect in the chromosome 4. This disease is basically caused by the unstable nucleotide repeat when there is abnormal and excessive repeat of the sequence of CAG again and again more than 40 times. It leads to Huntington's disease. Here, Huntington disease main symptom is chorea, that is, there's multiple random movements. Along with chorea, their personality changes and depression is seen. Along with these features, there is a significant and a very important phenomena associated, that is the anticipation. Anticipation basically refers to the process when, for example, if a father has Huntington's chorea at the age of 40, and if he has a daughter, then she may or may not develop Huntington's chorea. But if she develops Huntington chorea, it will be at an age earlier than at which his father developed the disease. For example, at age of 20 or at the age of 30. This process is known as the anticipation. Now let's talk about hemibialismus. Hemibialismus refers to the wild flanking movements of the proximal limb and is seen because of the involvement of the subthalamic nucleus. Athetosis refers to slow rhythmic involuntary movements, just like a very rhythmic movements, and it is because of the involvement of globus pallidus. The last but not the least is the Wilson's disease. Wilson's disease is an autosomal recessive defect in the copper ATP7B gene defect, causing accumulation of the copper in liver, brain, eye, etc. Accumulation of the copper in liver causes hepatitis, and accumulation of the copper in brain cause in it occurs in putamen mainly, and because of these two features the name comes hepatolenticular degeneration, because the putamen is commonly referred to as a putamen as a lentiform nucleus. In eye it can be demolished as a clear fissure rings being deposited on the cornea and can be seen clearly on the slit lamp examination of the eye. The treatment of the Wilson can be done by zinc trinitine, but the last resort of the Wilson disease is liver transplantation. That was it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video, and please like, share, comment and subscribe for more important medical topics. Thank you and welcome.